morning. So today we get to talk about one of my passions, free media. So this is something that I do and I study and I think about nearly every day. But I wonder if you can just take a moment to write your own definition of free media. So how would you define free media? So it's a term I'll introduce you to that's used in literature, that's used in scholarship, that's used by activists, that's used by media makers. But for you, what does free media mean? And at the end of our conversation today, we'll actually ask you to share your definition of free media. So do take a moment and write something down. Not a paragraph, not an essay, just a sentence. What is free media to you? So for today's conversation, I wanted to go through 3 parts. As I mentioned, we'll define free media, but we'll talk about opportunities and challenges. And this is based on a workshop that took place in Brazil, in Salvador, this past March. It was organized by Jasur, which is a radio network and station based on the web in Morocco. And so Jasur wanted to have a conversation at the World Social Forum to bring together people who are working on free media in Africa and the Middle East. And so I'll share with you the challenges and opportunities from the region. We'll talk about some of the policy opportunities and challenges using a couple of examples, but then we'll run through the sharing that happened at this workshop, where people really talked about the forms and practices of what they're trying to achieve to establish free media where they're working. So I'll share some of those stories with you today. Before we start, I wanted to share with you this idea that free media is media literacy. When you engage, when you participate in free media, you have an opportunity to participate in media education. These are my children here in the blue building a radio transmitter. So after this little green circuit board is soldered, you can hook it up to a battery and broadcast at 1 watt. She was 8 years old when she built this. It is so important to touch infrastructure, to understand how media is made, and it's so important to create media that's autonomous and independent from corporate and state control. As we talked about the examples of colonialism and imperialism yesterday, one way to push back against that corporate and state control is to make your own media. So here she was building a transmitter with her friend, who was 7, by the way, at the time. And her friend still talks today about the soldering iron burning her. And she has a tiny little scar on her finger from where my daughter touched her with the soldering iron. The other image is Saja, so this is Yafa. The other image is Saja, and she is playing her first record at CKUT Radio in Montreal. Again, this is a radio station that allows people into the station who otherwise don't have access to media. Children don't produce media very often. We don't hear their voices in broadcasting, or if we do, it's an adult who's interviewing them. My daughters, Yafa and Saja, do a radio show every summer when they're in Montreal, and they lead the interviews. They pick the music. They learn how to play records. And they learn how to facilitate a radio show and produce media from their perspective. And that's one of the goals of free media, is to amplify the voices we don't hear in other media, to bring to the center the perspectives that are marginalized. So free media, of course, is identified in the literature by scholars in many different ways. Academics are famous for naming things again and again and again. And you can see some of the ways in which it's been described. Free media, the term in and of itself, comes from French, media libre. There's also radical media, a book initially published in 1999 by Downing, or 2000. Small media, citizens media, autonomous media, media populares in Spanish, community radio, radio associative is the term that Ijasor uses in Morocco, because calling free media community broadcasting or community media, they say, at least in a Moroccan context, the term community can be a bit divisive. Whose community are you speaking about? So they prefer associative. And then social movement media. So to focus this conversation, I wanted to share at least one definition from the literature for you. And this is a great book if you are interested in reading a political economy and economic analysis of a media system in the region, but also how that's related to social change or revolution. There's this Small Media, Big Revolution work that was done by Annabelle Serendi Mohammadi and her partner Ali Mohammadi, published initially in 1994. She's still working, based in the UK now, no longer in the region, but she initially had defined small media, a kind of free media, as participatory, public, and controlled neither by states nor corporations. And so I think this is one of the more accessible definitions, easy to understand free media. So I want to share with you a couple of examples from bigger networks, practitioners. So the Global Association for Community Radio Stations. So this is not a scholarly network. This is not an academic definition. This is a practitioner, someone who worked and still works in community radio today. Steve Buckley, who's with the World Association of Community Radio Broadcasters. He was formerly their president. He's no longer with the association. He defined community broadcasting, a kind of free media, as having no single definition, because community media, free media, has to match the circumstances that it's broadcasting in, that it's being shared in as media. There's policy context, there's economic realities, there's the realities of who needs access, who's being marginalized in that media space. That's going to determine what the sound, what the form of that free media is like. And we'll see some of that in the examples that I'll share today. This is Radio Balad's definition. I had talked a bit about them yesterday. They described community radio, what they practice in Jordan. They also have a news website. They post videos. They're active on social media. They described community broadcasting as community-owned and controlled. So it's the community that determines the mandate. It's the community that determines the content. Giving access to voices in the community and encouraging diversity and creativity and participation. Participation not only in the production of the media, but participation in society as a whole. So again, when you build free media, you're building healthy societies because you're building active participants. I'll share with you a video clip from Voice of the Valley, a radio show that initially started on Radio Balad, and as I mentioned yesterday, the women moved ahead and opened their own community radio station in the Jordan Valley, but it's only online. It's not licensed. Despite the fact that they applied for a license, they were denied a license. So I'll play for you a clip from a producer who made a film about Voice of the Valley and the women who started the program. You can watch the full movie online, but I'll just have the opportunity to play the clip for you today. And I'll ask you after the clip if you can identify for me why the media that they make might be considered free media.
quite honest, to see two young women that they want to do something for the sake of the community. It's really very hard to live within such a community like the Jordan Valley because it's a male-dominated society, very conservative.
وهو البرنامج الوحيد اللي في الأردن بيركز وبيحكي عن منطقة الأهوار.
At the beginning there was a kind of rejection because they were women, young women in particular, so it wasn't easy.
تعرضت أنا لمرتين إنه لهجوم، لأنه بدك تحكي مع المسؤول الموجود بالمنطقة، ليش تروحي لحدا أعلى منه؟
They were passionate to make a change in their community. They were also passionate about the media work.
To see them full of determination and to say, you know what, I'm going to go ahead and to blaze a new pathway in the Jordan Valley, for me, that is an accomplishment. It's a feat, not even an accomplishment.
So what for you about this clip of Munira and her partner, producer there, speaking about the media that they make, or Salsan there speaking about these young women taking to the airwaves and making this show about events in the Jordan Valley? What for you?
Hello. I think it defines free media, they define free media through being non-governmentally owned, and the fact that they're members of that community participating in media for the sake of the community while not receiving any funding from any outside political or corporate sources. So that means this is free journalism, journalism for the sake of the community, because in today's age we can do that through digital means.
So that's one of the ways to talk about free media as having no filters, meaning that there's not levels of either financial or editorial control that are being imposed on these producers. They have the freedom to tell the stories. It's also not someone coming from outside the community into the community and recording the stories from their point of view. The point of view of the storytelling is from the people who are most directly affected by the story itself, which is the opposite of how we typically define journalism. You can think of objectivity and issues like that determine that a journalist has to not be from a community or tied close to an issue in order to cover an issue. But there are ways in which stories actually can be told differently if you send someone from that community to cover the story. In some ways, some communities won't give the same access to an outsider to certain truths or certain stories because that person's not from the community. This happens in Canada all the time. If you want to cover issues on a First Nations reserve and you go there, people will literally turn their back to you because you're coming out in, get the story, and you go back out. The community has nothing to gain from the story, and you have everything to gain as the outside journalist. Anybody else want to share about their perspectives of what this defines as free media for them, this clip from Voice of the Valley? Sure. There's also here.
Good morning.
Morning.
Also, I noticed that their insistence and their determination to be listened to is part of their freedom. We noticed that she said that her family was attacked and so, and she met the society and the community. This is part of the freedom of media itself.
Sure, sure. So that's one of the struggles that free media face worldwide. In fact, one of the articles I published about the history of community broadcasting, the history of free media, is called A History of Struggle. It's not by accident that the highest target in terms of journalism deaths worldwide are community broadcasters, are people broadcasting for non-state, non-corporate outlets. Those are the ones targeted first, often worldwide. So right here, there was two. Oh, you have a mic.
I saw two things from the video. The first one is they said it's for the first time that two women are empowered to have such kind of media. So it's free media is basically related to empowering minorities, females, like black people, migrants, refugees who are not able usually to access the mainstream media because they are minorities, and mainstream media that has certain political agendas won't allow them to speak very freely. Secondly, they said they are the first ones to reach a certain place. I didn't catch the name. So they are tackling some issues or maybe problems, social problems, that mainstream media may neglect completely because of their political agendas or because they basically don't care about such marginalized or deprived place. So actually they are giving more space for tackling the really complicated social problems that may be not important for the agenda of the mainstream media.
That's exactly right. Did you want to add your comment? No? Yeah.
Okay. I don't know if you agree with me or not that we didn't have a clear or pure free media. Maybe free media and production and the system or technique of production, not in the content, because all the time we have a homogenic discourse, and even if we didn't have the authority of government, we have another side try to direct audience toward a certain trend.
So the hegemonic discourses, the sensitive social issues that are normally silenced in the media, this is where free media can come in and open up spaces, and it may take time, it might take generations to fully address things, but there are ways in which free media worldwide have really changed the media landscape. Just to give you an example that maybe is common knowledge today, common sense, you would never even think it was an issue. Black people on air, hip hop music on air. This was not common. Even in Africa, with the British colonial system of radio infrastructure set up in Kenya, it was only up until the 1990s that black people were allowed on air. You look in Montreal, Canada, what's called urban music, hip hop music, wasn't on the corporate stations, wasn't played by CBC. It was on the community radio stations, right? So opening up space and making normal what's marginal is the role of free media, and also not being afraid to touch the sensitive issues. That might put individual journalists in danger. That might put institutions like Radio Balad in danger. It might put them in disfavor. You know, I told you yesterday I interviewed audiences. There were audiences who shared their concerns that sometimes Radio Balad might promote sectarianism or racism because of some of the issues that they cover, the way they cover. But it's good for Radio Balad to hear that feedback because it's ultimately the community that they're serving and what they're hearing and what they're understanding that should be determining how they're delivering the program. Is there a way that they can deliver the program so that people understand the goal is not sectarianism, the goal is not racism, it's actually against those things. So how can they do it differently to address those concerns? I want to move to another example, more local. Anyone know this place? Do you want to tell us where it's at?
What I know is it's a small pub in Maram Khail Street, Shafiq.
So it's not just a pub. There is also a web radio station inside the pub that goes live almost nightly. And I'll play a short video so that you can understand why this radio was created. And then after, I will ask you the same question: what defines this as free media?
Burn a fire! 5, 4, 3, 2, fire!
Sorry, that didn't work. I'm going to have to try it again. This is what we call dead air in radio, or happy silences.
is Jihad. I work for UNMAS, the United Nations Mine Action Service. I'm involved in demining and landmine, UXO, EOD clearance operations in South Lebanon. I've also done this in various other countries like Sudan, South Sudan, Darfur, Kosovo, Bosnia, and more recently in Cyprus. This is the warhead of an air bomb. It was about 10 or so years back. I was DJing just down the road at a local bar that belongs to a friend of mine. And I happened to be playing some local tracks from local musicians, and people were approaching me, asking me, who's this and who's that? We never heard this before. And I said, this is from here, man. This is from Beirut City. This is a local artist, local musician. They're like, wow, that's amazing. And so I thought, you know, we need to do something about getting this music out there. So I thought to start a little radio station, and hence you have Radio Beirut.
Radio Beirut is a hub for local and regional music. It's a platform, a mouthpiece for these types of musicians, for these types of artists to discover themselves and let others discover them. Not only in the city, you know, with a live audience, but also online, because we're an online radio station. You know, Lebanon has a huge diaspora, and a lot of this diaspora is nostalgic to listen to what's happening here because it's so far away for them. You know, people in Sweden and Los Angeles, New York, and Latin America. You just log on to radiobeirut.net and click listen live.
We're gonna get little, we got more coming.
And it happens, because this is what happens when you shoot live.
Yes.
He's the guy laughing behind you. We'll do it again.
That's Beirut.
So what for you makes this an example of free media?
Good morning, everyone. I think towards the end when he said that it's the connection that's made between the Lebanese communities in the diaspora and those bands that maybe they have a problem or like difficulties in being sponsored to be broadcasted or to be presented in paid media platforms. On the other hand, this online radio station offers them the opportunity to be heard, regardless, I think, of the content of what they're presenting. And for me as a Palestinian as well, I've seen it through my experience living abroad. When people ask, is this what we hear in the media, what's really happening? So I instantly direct them towards such outlets to kind of get a glimpse of what's on the real world that's not presented on the media that we're all familiar with.
He also talked about music. Does anybody have any suggestions about what of the music that they air makes it free media, say in comparison to the other radio stations? Do you want to go on that side? Sure.
It's actually hip-hop, underground rap, self-produced albums. Most famously, like Chino, he's a Lebanese rapper but sings in English. There are multiple bands that have like open mic nights there, and they basically all independently produced, and they go there to promote like cyphers or freestyles, stuff like that.
So it sounds like you've been there before. Yeah. So yeah, that's right. It's local music. It's also making that connection to communities abroad. It's not necessarily heavy on the news. Radio Beirut did participate in Radio Free Palestine, which I'll talk about in a minute. And Jihad was one of the hosts for that program. So there's not just opportunities and people making media in ways, making spaces to produce, to broadcast that produce and create spaces for free media, but there's also the policy that creates opportunities, but it also creates challenges. And some of this is inherited in the region from the colonial systems that were set up. As I mentioned yesterday, I showed you the broadcasting infrastructure that was initially set up by the British in Palestine. That was across the region. The various colonies that were created by Western powers also set up broadcasting infrastructure. And that infrastructure was inherited through independence movements by young states. And there was what was called, Douglas Boyd famously calls transistor revolutions, where the 1950s not only saw independent states being created across the region of Africa and the Middle East, but also saw those revolutions being assisted by the introduction of radio. Radio became very accessible with the transistor and the way in which you could receive it on a little radio, just carry it in your pocket with a battery, or even wind it up and have a generator inside the radio as well. And so these transistor revolutions, you can think of Nasser and famously the Voice of Cairo in Egypt going and broadcasting across the region in the speeches and so on. So these are examples that are from the literature, and I have the citations down here, of how policy is determined generally across the region and what we can see in terms of the wording of policies being vague, often to promote and monopolize the power of the media. And these are ways in which the marginalized voices are kept out of media, in which censorship happens not only directly by a ministry to a broadcaster, but even self-censorship of journalists. And this is one of the reasons why when I worked at Radio Balad, I saw tons of young people working at the radio station, because established journalists have more institutional ideas about self-censorship than, say, people who haven't yet worked in the system. And so that was one of the reasons why I was told there was a lot of young people working there. We can also see that media policy in general, if we want to speak specifically about the experience in Jordan, has changed over time, and it's been shaped by different geopolitical time periods. So we can think about colonialism, we can think about changing demographics. We talked yesterday about neoliberal economic developments. The new audiovisual media law was passed in 2015, seeing some changes. So previously, when I did my research in Radio Balad in 2012 and 2013, there was a surcharge on top of the license fee that already exists. So despite the fact that Radio Balad is a community broadcaster, they still have to pay the same license fee that all other radio broadcasters pay. And then on top of that, before, with the old law that was passed in 2002, they had to pay a surcharge. So a 50% surcharge for the right to be able to broadcast news. And so they organized, along with other radio stations, along with international organizations for advocating for journalism and the right to access news, to remove this component of the law. And so with the new law that was adopted in 2015, this was removed. But there's still no provisions for community broadcasters, and as we heard with the story of Voice in the Valley's experience, it's still not easy to get a license today. We also see the example in Tunisia, post-revolution. There were new laws introduced, an independent commission set up, but then with the revisions that have come down in January 2018, there's been international and local NGOs from across the region, including AMARC, the World Association of Community Radio Broadcasters, who are speaking against some of the limitations in the new bill. And so I have here the links if you want to read more about the policies that were introduced post-revolution in Tunisia and then have recently. So to move on to the situation in Palestine, we talked a little bit about Palestine yesterday. There is no licensing in the West Bank or Gaza. There's only unauthorized Palestinian media. We also know that radio stations and television stations are not allowed for Palestinians living in the state of Israel. We also have regular IDF attacks on Palestinian journalists every day in stations. Equipment gets smashed. I wanted to play it from you. If you haven't seen this movie, you might like to check it out.
أنا انولدت وعشت كل حياتي في بلعين، قرية اللي واقعة بين التلال. القرية واقعة داخل الأراضي المحتلة من الضفة الغربية. هذول هم ال5 كاميرات تاعتي، كل كاميرا مرحلة في الحياة. في مرة يجي مهندس إسرائيلي يعمل كيسات عشان يبنوا جدار فاصل في وسط أرضنا. في هذا اليوم انكسرت كاميرتي الأولى بقنبلة غاز. لما بصير إشي في القرية على طول بحس إني لازم أصور.
ما شوفت شو بيصير فينا من ورا هذا التصوير، من ورا هدول الشغلات، شوفت.
حكيت انا يا ابو محمد ما فيش هيك مقرض هنا جوا الجدار هون.
لا ولا شيء.
شو فيش هيك تقدرش نسوي زي
يا زلمه يمكن في بنى.
أنا بعرف إنهم بجوز يدقوا عبابي في أي دقيقة، بس راح أضل أصور. هذا بيساعدني إني أواجه الحياة وأضل عايش.
So it's the story of an independent journalist working in the village of Belin, and his 5 cameras broken again and again. Even journalists who have the protection of an institution, even if it's an international institution, can be attacked, can be jailed. We know that Palestinians are publishing newspapers and websites as a way to create a space for the Palestinian perspective in the media to share news and information. They also share news and information via social media, but it's not free media. Sharing news and information is essential to use, as we talked about yesterday, a diversity of tactics to get perspectives out, but there's no control over the social media space. In fact, there's corporations and governments who can easily dominate that space, either through control of the internet and when it's on and when it's off, or control of the information. And Facebook, it's been well documented, honors 98% of the requests from Israel to shut down, silence, or otherwise delete Palestinian posts and accounts. They even went so far, Israel, to jail for now it's going to be 3 years. She was recently sentenced, a poet, for posting a poem on social media. So yeah, social media is not free media. In the West, it's not as easy to have the Palestinian perspective heard in the media. The first show produced by a Palestinian in North America was launched 27 years ago in Vancouver on a community radio station. That show is no longer on air, it's still a website. There's another program airing at my radio station in Montreal called Under the Olive Tree. And a few years ago, we started a program called Radio Free Palestine as a way to connect with producers in Palestine in all continents who are in solidarity with the Palestinian people to air content on the Nakba Day to remember the Nakba, but also to commemorate 364 days a year. You don't hear the Palestinian perspective on the conflict, on the war, on the occupation. But for one day, we can flip the media by creating a free media space and amplifying Palestinian voices. And so I wanted to play for you an audio clip from Radio Free Palestine. This is the first edition that won an award in 2008 at the 60th anniversary of the Palestinian Nakba.
Palestinian society was dismantled, dispersed, and scattered. About 400 Palestinian towns and villages were erased, completely erased, as if they had never existed. The names of other towns and rivers and mountains and streets were changed from Arabic to Hebrew. Palestine ceased to exist. You can't find it on the maps of the world today. Palestine was destroyed as a country. Now, the destruction of Palestine did not happen as the unintended consequence of unforeseen events. It was planned to happen.
I lived in Palestine, first in Jerusalem, and then in Jaffa, Tel Aviv. It was all Arab. There were few Jewish colonists. Arabs ran Palestine. Arabs were the officials, the judges, the jailers, the working people, the workers of Arab Palestine.
Palestine.
To Radio Free Palestine.
Radio Free Palestine.
Up next, we will hear from Ali Al-Yasir from Jaffa, the oldest of the speakers. He was at Princeton University in the United States when his home in Jaffa was occupied by Zionist militias. Mazen Al-Khairi from Ramle was 10 years old in 1948. He speaks on the resistance that held off the Zionist brigades for 2 months. Fuad Sahyun, also from Haifa, shares his memories of fleeing the war at the age of 4.
What do you remember?
What do I remember? I remember everything.
How old were you in 1948?
I was just under 10 years old.
And what do you remember from 1948?
I remember the first attack on Ramle, the town's fighters, and they got some help from the villages around us, and we drove the Israelis back. As children, we used to help the women, either to roll gauze for the wounded or clean the bullets from the rust and so on, and put them according to their size in different boxes so that they are used by the resistance people.
Were people prepared for a war?
Yeah, well, of course, I mean, we've heard about what happened with other villages and cities and the ethnic cleansing that was going on. The following day, Ramle fell. So my grandfather, I remember this very distinctly. He said, we were under the British, and now we are under the Israelis.
So as I mentioned, this broadcast takes place throughout the day. And so for a full day, and this year it was 24 hours, the Palestinian perspective of what happened in 1948, or the Palestinian perspective about what's happening now, is the perspective that is aired. It's not balanced between the Israeli point of view and the Palestinian point of view. No, this is a place for Palestinian voices, and this is how we can create free media spaces by linking up across continents different community broadcasters. We're able to create a mass media platform for the Palestinian people, something that they don't have access to. And we're really trying to change through this media to educate listeners about the story of Palestine. There's a great documentary by Sut Jali, who's come to MD Lab numerous times before, called Media Peace in the Promised Land, or Propaganda Peace in the Promised Land. You can see versions of it on YouTube, where he asked his undergraduate students in New York City, who's occupying who? Are the Palestinians occupying Israelis, or are the Israelis occupying Palestinians? And more often than not, his students in university say Palestinians are occupying Israel. This is why it's so important to tell the story of the Palestinian people and the story, to share the news of today. So to move on to the workshop that happened in Brazil, I wanted to offer you some of the examples of people trying to create free media like this in the region of the Middle East and Africa. And I'll start with the challenges in Swaziland. Sibili spoke from Swaziland. She works with rural women in education issues. She said it's important for these women to access something like community broadcasting, because otherwise they don't have access to go to school. They don't have a means to represent their voices in the media, because all the media is state-owned. And she mentioned this case of a journalist who dared to write a story about the king and some shady dealings that he engaged with as the king, who had to leave to South Africa or otherwise fear for his life in Swaziland. So there is efforts in Swaziland to create local community broadcasting, but they've been doing it since the 90s. So we see them for decades working to try to establish community broadcasting, but that's what's great about getting to know free media activists. They're very persistent. They don't give up. And so there might be an opportunity this year where the state offers some temporary licensing for community radio stations in Swaziland. We have the experience of the FLN in Algeria, which set up radio stations initially to broadcast against the French colonizers there. And Frantz Fanon has a really great article that you can find in French or English about the experience of tuning in to Radio Algiers for the first time. Radio in Algeria was not popular among locals, among the indigenous people of Algeria, because the French, as I had mentioned before, the French colonizers set up the broadcasting infrastructure. And so for many Algerians before Radio Algiers, they thought that, or the Voice of Algiers rather, they thought that the radio was something that was, to listen to it was to be colonized. So Frantz Fanon talks about the shift in Algerian society of people having that opportunity to hear their local languages for the first time, or to hear news from their perspective, from the revolutionary perspective for the first time. And there was actually a rush on radios in Algeria, and the French colonizers made it illegal to own radios or even purchase batteries in the colony to try to prevent the spread of people listening to the Voice of Algiers. So all of this is described in Frantz Fanon's article. You can have a look at that. This is an example of radio free media in Algeria today. Yasmina from Radio Raj spoke about this community radio as one that's dedicated to youth. She also spoke about how freedom of expression is guaranteed in the Constitution, as it is in many constitutions in the region, as many of the states in the region have signed on to human rights declarations either locally or internationally, and many of those declarations have provisions for access to communication, freedom of speech, but in practice, in some of, in countries across the region, in practice, some of the experiences are that there's not freedom of expression. She spoke about how once there was a protest in the southern part of Algeria, and they had used radio to mobilize people, and it happened very successfully. Many people came out for the demonstration, but then the radio station was attacked and shut down by the government. So Radio Raj is an internet radio station. It focuses on amplifying youth voices, it covers demonstrations, and it covers cultural activities. They don't just broadcast from their radio station, they go out to events and broadcast and cover events live. They also do some video work as well that they're sharing on social media. We also, at the workshop in Brazil, heard about the challenges in Morocco, where up until the 1990s, media was dominated by state ownership, but we've seen the introduction of some private ownership. We also have web radios that have been set up across the region, and we heard from Mina, Yassine, and Mohammed speaking about their experiences with their web radio stations. So Mina is Amazigh. She works at a radio station that only exists online. The radio station is called Radio Imsli, and Imsli and Amazigh means my voice, and the slogan of the radio station is my voice in my language. And she described the Amazigh people as the indigenous inhabitants of Morocco, and so she said this is why Radio Imsli is dedicated to the rights of hearing and broadcasting the Amazigh language, but also focused on women's voices and women's perspectives. It's an association, a non-governmental organization that set up this radio station that brings together Amazigh women, and so that's why the radio station also shares the same mandate and mission as the association. She said they had a number of programs that they launched talking about the issues of Amazigh women. They focused on education around marriage of minors. They also did a program on March 8th. We talked a bit about International Women's Day yesterday. They did something on March 8th, International Women's Day this year. They said that the radio station has the goal to give women the opportunity to talk about their problems because they're not allowed to discuss women's problems in other media. Yassine spoke from Kesh Radio. Kesh Radio is in Marrakesh, and it focuses on the rights of youth to communicate. They had 2 special programs that they did. They're a very new station, but you can find some of their content on their SoundCloud accounts. They had one program called Radio Montagne, so mountain radio, and they went up into the mountains and they facilitated interviews and production of radio and video with people living in the area, so villages and rural areas, and those people were able to talk about issues that they wanted to talk about. And Radio Scolaire, so school radio, or radio, making radio in school, so school radio. They went into a school program and they taught the students how to do broadcasting and focused the content around the rights of children, gender equality issues, hate speech, promoting tolerance, and they got the youth to produce radio around these topics. One of the concerns that was raised during the workshop by Yassine was the fact that the web radios have collaborated together to produce ethical charters. So what are community web radios in Morocco standing against? What are they standing for? They've also produced editorial guidelines, but those guidelines have happened station by station. Now they're working to create a general editorial guideline that would apply to all stations. But all of these initiatives have come from the web radios themselves, because there's no guidelines, there's no policies in Morocco with regard to online content. And that's true in many regions. So there's a lot of freedom online, but there's also a lot of limitations in the sense of people have to have the internet to listen to you. And also the internet is not under your control. So it can be slowed down or even shut off at the will of corporations or states. Mohammed talked about Ijasur and some of the activities that they've done. Ijasur had 2 temporary licenses recently issued. The first was issued around 22, which was the 2016 United Nations Climate Change Conference. They had temporary authorization to broadcast on air about climate issues. And this broadcast was carried on in 18 countries around the world. They also did the same thing for Media Information Literacy Week, which is hosted by UNESCO in October every year. They did a special broadcast on media and information literacy, and they received a temporary license about this as well. So I want to conclude with some best practices from Senegal. Senegal established community licensing within their regulatory policies in the 1990s. Before that, they had some temporary experiences. But since then, it's proliferated. We see now 30 community radio stations that have also opened up, 30 community radio stations, 14 different regions of Senegal. And these community radio stations have upgraded themselves to be multimedia centers based on the needs of the communities that they're in. So they've created partnerships with local community organizations, NGOs, and focusing the radio production that they do around rights issue. It's also provided citizens access to media production that they would otherwise have to pay for by creating studios in their house, or even access to the internet to do e-commerce, to talk with friends abroad. So they're helping citizens reduce their digital costs at home, the bill of having access to the internet at home, by providing multimedia centers in regions across the country. They've also worked with the government being very supportive of their initiatives to help reduce poverty, to help focus some of the training, some of the content that they produce and air on these community radio stations, which are on the FM dial, but also online, many of them as well. The content focuses on sustainable development and rights issues for citizens. They've also had a recent effort through a government sponsorship and with funding from UNESCO to do workshops on climate change. And so they are basically the local source for education about climate change. So when I started at the beginning and I talked about free media as an example of media literacy, it's not just literacy about media, it's also literacy in general. All kinds of education is afforded through access to media. And so in this case, climate change has been a key outcome of some of the community broadcasting efforts. There's a video in French that you can read, that you can watch if you speak French, about the CMCs, the community media centers across Senegal. So I ask you, just in terms of interacting about some of the ideas and examples that I shared today, at the beginning, I asked you to write down your own definition of free media. Could you think about your definition again and revise it if you have any revision? How would you define free media now after having this presentation and thinking about it? If you want to share the definition you wrote down before, please do. You don't have to be shy. No one's hajjul here. So what is your definition of free media now? And can you share with us perhaps your first definition? Yep. And then we'll come here.
I think free media is reporting the truth to people, the fullest version of the truth, leaving aside who funds the media, who is buying the media, and all the filters between them. And because this is almost impossible, this is what media literacy is about. For us to understand that no media is totally free or totally objective, and this is why we have to look to the media content in a critical manner.
For sure, and it's through your experiences working with free media that you can also produce coverage that criticizes other media. One of the shows that I pointed to yesterday was Eye on the Media at Radio Balad. It was a very popular show. It's a popular website produced by Sausan, who you saw speaking in the Voice of the Valley video as well. People love to hear media analysis, and it can actually inform your own free media practices to understand critically what is behind a story, but also the education of production processes itself, and how news gets produced, and what news is chosen, say, for a headline, and how that's framed, how that happens. So there's people here, there, and
okay, I don't know. I want to share what I understand.
Sure.
I think the most important responsibility of media literacy in this topic, not only to learn people how to the skills of getting information from the free media to discover another side of truth, but also differentiate between the social media discourse at all and the free media discourse. Because we have a trends and homogenic discourse, and social media doesn't give us the truth all the time. So this is the responsibility of media literacy only.
So there can be many truths, and I think what social media and free media might allow is access to more stories and more narratives. I think the quote that I shared from Edward Said yesterday is relevant to your comment about which narratives are heard and which narratives are suppressed. And so yes, there's an opportunity on social media to perhaps access more narratives, or with free media to access more narratives, but there's also the limitations, right? Social media, as I described with Facebook, it's very difficult to access some narratives when they're being deleted, when they're being removed, when accounts are being taken offline. There's also the issue of Twitter bots and wars that happen. We saw with the counter narratives and the hijackings of hashtags yesterday in the conversation. So these are all concerns. Now on the free media side with web radios, there can be limitations to being able to not only just access those narratives, not everybody has streaming internet at home and can tune into those radio stations. It's great when they go out into the community and broadcast. You know, Radio Beirut broadcasts from a bar. Not everybody's going to go to a bar to participate at a radio station. So there can be limitations even with free media and how accessible it is, or which narratives are heard. Even a station like Radio Balad, the second time I went into the field, there were people saying, oh, I wish I could hear more of this narrative or that narrative, or I don't feel comfortable at Radio Balad talking about these issues on air. So even within free media, there can be people who don't feel that it's an accessible space to share their stories. Do you want to come here and here?
الحرية يعني قد ترتبط بنقل الرسائل أو حرية نقل الرسائل من المواطنين أو الشارع العام إلى السلطة السياسية، وبالتالي حرية تبادل المعلومات ما بين أو حلقة وصل ما بين الشارع وما بين السلطة السياسية، سواء كان على مستوى الداخلي أو على المستوى الخارجي. فبالتالي يمكن يعني طبعا للتعبير للزيادة في عمليات المشاركة، للزيادة في مثلا تغيير وجهة نظر الرأي العام، وهذا طبعا يرتبط بحرية الرأي وحرية التعبير.
Of course, one of the goals, as I had mentioned with free media, is not just to encourage participation in the production of media, but in the participation of society in and of itself. That was one of the things that audience members told me again and again about having the opportunity to listen to Radio Balad. They were hearing points of view about politics, about political discussions, different histories, different experiences that they would never hear addressed in other media. And all of that helps inform their own worldview, helps inform their own political decisions making. Even listeners at Radio Balad got organized into a listeners club. So they created their own space for social action in the community by being active in this listeners club. So it's interesting how being active in community media is not just a listening, not just a passive receiver when it comes to free media. Free media listeners, free media audiences are often active also in their community because of the education experiences that they have on the radio station. So there was a comment here, and then we'll come.
Since yesterday, I want to tell you that it's not anymore for me free Occupy Media. It's specifically Occupy the Internet or Occupy their private Facebook and Twitter accounts. So when I think about what free media is or what the internet is, it's a free person who have a free mind and a free spirit. Today I'm not using my social media accounts as I used to be in 2011. So in addition to losing 90% of those whom I used to follow, they are either depressed, dead, or in prison. Me myself, it's like I'm always writing and erasing. I'm thinking too much before I write, so it's not free, but it's me. It's self-censorship before anything else, because there will always be laws and regulations, either pro freedom of expression or against, but it's about the person himself making the decision that he has a purpose that's louder than the fear of any consequences. And for me, out of experience, it's getting out there and getting my 5 cameras broken.
In social media, we have the limitations of how the social media is set up. Right? With Twitter, they've recently extended the number of characters you can use, but still, how much of a narrative can be told in a single tweet? So it's important to consider when we're creating free media or when we're taking space as free media activists, what kind of space are we taking and how to strategically use that space as well to the best of our abilities given the limitations of that space. What was that?
Being educated through media literacy and knowing about media ethics and how to be professional as much as possible. Yes.
Exactly. So, do you want to come here on this side? Everybody will get a chance. We have time.
So I'm gonna just mix the two definitions together, but yeah, I completely believe that one day we should have free media, but as well, we are not. Media in itself, it's called the fourth power, and it cannot be just random and I go crazy and say whatever I want. Because I think I cannot say that I'm gonna just solve math in whatever way I want. So I should have not regulations, but rules that I follow to do the freedom in a right way. Because if we don't know how to be free, what's the meaning of freedom? So I'm gonna just use it in a really wrong way. So that's when free media literacy comes and tell you how to be free. So I get educated and literate in media, so I know how to criticize without offending someone. And also, I think some topics we cannot just be so free about them, and I can just go and dig behind my government, for example, and show like so confidential stuff that can lead to wars or civil wars or whatever. So I think whoever should use the freedom of speech thing or think about to be free, he or she should follow the media literacy. It should be well educated and well literate, media literate, I mean, so to practice this freedom. Yeah, so that's all.
It sounds like you and Hent need to have a conversation because she's interested in media ethics as well. And your comment builds great off of her comment, but also the first slide that I showed, that free media is about media literacy. We don't just have free media because it's free. It has consequences, and you have to learn about those consequences of accessing the privilege to have a microphone. And if you can't face those consequences because you don't have policies, you don't have ethics, you don't understand what you're doing in the first place, then you will face consequences. So that's extremely important. And just to give you an example, because you used an example of the state and perhaps causing problems for the state, there are ways in which free media can cause problems for social movements. You don't want to explain how, for example, the protest was organized from start to finish and who did what, because they might be targeted, right? There were instances in Montreal where citizen journalists filmed people doing quote-unquote illegal things, and then those videos were put online, and then the police used those videos to take people to court. And despite those media activists being asked, please take this down. Well, first of all, anything you put on the internet is there forever. Like, there's no taking down anything ever. That's the first rule of media literacy when it comes to the internet. But at the same time, it was still easily available online. People didn't take it down. And so those activists were taken to court, and that footage, that free media footage, was used because it was free media without ethics, which is not free media. It's free for all media. So we had a few comments here. Maybe we can go on this side, and then we'll come back over here.
أعتقد برأيي أعتقد برأيي هو التعبير عن آرائهم ومواضيعهم من خلال إنشاء إذاعة تمثلهم وتوفر لهم الأغاني الخاصة بهم أو المواضيع الأخرى كالخدمات، وإعطائهم مساحة من الحرية لكي يكون وجودهم في المجتمع ليس مخفيا، والتعبير عنهم بموضوعية ومهنية من أجل تعريف الآخرين بثقافاتهم أو ربما الانتماء إليهم من خلال ما يطرحوه بالإذاعة، وبالتالي يكون استقطاب للجمهور أكثر من خلال محطة إذاعية يحبوها سواء عن طريق الإنترنت أو الأف ام.
It's very true that when you have different marginal voices representing themselves from their perspectives, that many people are able to meet for the first time. You know, we all live in our own busy lives, our own very restricted geographies sometimes. And so meeting people from different perspectives can sometimes be difficult. And this is the root of racism, sectarianism, xenophobia, other sorts of systemic social problems, is the fact that people are never able to meet on their own terms. And so free media can help create those first-time meetings. And it's not always positive. Sometimes there's repercussions because of it, but there has to be persistence in making those spaces accessible spaces and dealing with the repercussions of those misencounters and moving it towards more positive encounters. So maybe we'll do one more here and then we'll switch to this side. Go ahead.
My question is about funding. Where do these radio stations get their funding? Who owns them? And is this model sustainable? A few years back in Egypt, we had a community online newspaper for the Armenian community. It was very popular with youth. It was very visual. But then the person who started this initiative traveled, and the project just went away. So how to make these things, these organizations sustainable, and what funding can they do? Because producing media is very expensive. So we can't, yes, these are great.
Of community radio stations worldwide do depend on funding, whether it's through international or national mechanisms. It could be foundations, it can be international NGOs. There's a lot of money that comes through different foundations based in, say, Europe, that get money from different European countries, and then the foundation will distribute it to community radios. But then that also depends on the whim of the foundation. There was recently a foundation that's based in Europe that was supporting a lot of opening of community radio stations across the Middle East and Africa region that recently had to shut down because, yeah, this wasn't because of the government per se that they had to shut down. They had to shut down because the European countries that were previously funding them decided that post quote-unquote revolutions in the region, that now all the state media was public media, and therefore we need to be supporting public media in the region and not community radio stations. So being tied only to foundation money is not sustainable. One of the reasons Democracy Now! Is as it is with regard to the critique that Max Blumenthal talked about yesterday is in part tied to foundation funding, and he wrote a report about that recently. There's also the problem with regard to sustainability of some stations worldwide turning to listeners to fund them. That doesn't necessarily work across all regions, but there was, in the 1940s, a network of community radio stations that were launched in the States, as well as in Bolivia, that depended on the support of listeners. In KPFA in Berkeley, California, Lewis Hill established the Pacifica Foundation Radio Network based on the idea that if people want an anti-war perspective in media, they will pay a few dollars to help support that. And if you can get 10% of your listening base in an urban area to give money, then you have enough money to support radio. Remember that radio is one of the most accessible and affordable forms of media production. You don't need a giant camera, you don't need a huge investment in broadcasting equipment with regard to the tower to produce it. The same thing with regard to print. Paper is now a very expensive resource. So radio remains very affordable, which is why it's still very resilient. It's also very easy to set up, which is why after natural disasters like the hurricane that destroyed the electrical network in Puerto Rico, the next day radio stations were on air, providing information to communities across the island for where water was, where they could get access to food and whatnot. The issue with Bolivia was that it was a union of workers who decided they wanted a radio station to help them organize, to help share news from the union's perspective. Again, dealing with a very repressive state for the workers, they needed this radio station to survive. So all the union members, rather than just paying dues to the union, paid a small amount of their due to the radio station to be able to establish that radio station. So the listener sponsorship model, or the union sponsorship model, is a way in which you can create a small amount of sustainable funds. The network of community radio stations that I talked about in in Senegal, they initially got some funding from UNESCO and USAID, but even USAID has its limitations. There's repercussions when you sign that contract and get money from USAID. If your broadcasting is deemed against the political objectives of USAID, you can face lawsuits for the money that they invested in your project. So there's limitations there. Those community media centers, one of the ways that they're able to access sustainable funds beyond the development funds that they access is through having members of the community subscribe to access the space. So rather than them paying the full cost of an internet bill, they pay like 1/10 of that to the community media center and they access the space and maybe get more access than others because they paid a little bit more. So we'll come to this side and then we'll come back over here, okay?
About the question, what is your definition of free media now? In the beginning and now, I still have the same opinion regarding the definition of free media is the ability to express oneself in media, but due to the fact that even community radio stations are still under governmental rule, governmental law. They still have to, like for example, Lebanon on social media, if you tweet a tweet regarding someone, you are immediately taken into questioning. Even now, while I'm on the live feed, if I were to discuss it and discuss the person in a negative light, I would be brought in for questioning because of certain laws we have. But around the world, underground media, which is media that's broadcasted through underground means like Tor, if you're familiar with Tor, even though it is considered illegal in many countries and considered unethical due to the fact that you can have access to free media journalism through it, but you can also have access to much darker content. But the matter of the fact still remains that due to the fact almost all governments, there isn't a government that wouldn't interfere with anything that happens on air or happens on social media. The only way to actually have free media is through those means, through uncontrollable means.
So, you know, I might sound like I'm a huge radio fan here, but I am, because radio is one of those things that you can literally carry in your pocket, plug it into a battery, and boom, we're broadcasting. We could broadcast in this room right now without the government interfering. Now, they might come after us and try to take that transmitter from us, but there is a way that you can access broadcasting immediately and locally and outside of government control, outside of the influence of corporations, and that is through low-power FM broadcasting. I was part of a book that was edited about the history of pirate radio in Canada called Islands of Resistance, and it talks about the different experiences historically, and at the time the book was published in 2010, and it's available online. You can go to islandsofresistance.ca and download the full book, but it even has resources on how to build your own pirate radio station. Now, it's called pirate radio only because it's unlicensed. You don't have to ask a government or a corporation for permission to set up this broadcasting. But that is one of the means. I mean, you had talked about Tor, that's a means on the internet. There are lots of people who create zines. There's a great book, again, it's available online, called Autonomous Media, that speaks about zines and other types of autonomous broadcasting and publishing, autonomous journalism that exist outside of corporate and state influence. So there are many traditions, and it's existed for a long time whenever broadcasting was introduced, radio broadcasting. One of the first experiences of that was during the Irish Rebellion against the British, and this is even before the microphone was introduced. Irish rebels ran into the telegraph and started beeping out noises for the revolution. Obviously they got arrested and so on, but media has always been usurped for agendas, revolutionary agendas. You can look at every type of medium and look at ways in which people have used tactics to try to take that away from corporate or state control and create their own spaces. So we had a comment here, the lady in orange.
مرحبا. بداية أقول إنه بالنسبة لحرية الإعلام اللي هو مفهوم ظهر بعد تطور تكنولوجيا الاتصال وظهور قنوات التواصل. أعتبرها أنا برأيي أنه هي أكذوبة ابتدعتها الحكومات من أجل امتصاص غضبها، أو هي كصمام أمان حتى أنه الشعب يظل في حالة يعني يتكلم يعبر عن رأيه ولكن لا يوجد نتيجة. صح ولا لا؟ ثانياً بالنسبة لي أنا بالعراق، إحنا قبل أسبوعين صارت مظاهرات من أجل مظاهرات سلمية من أجل مطالبة بأبسط حقوق المواطن اللي هو الخدمات، الماء، الكهرباء، التعيين. تعرفون أنه بالعراق أنه أصحاب شهادات لا يجون بدون تعيين. قامت الحكومة بضربهم وسجنهم فرق قوات مقاومة الشغب، وأيضا قامت بحجب خدمة الإنترنت في سبيل أنه ما يصير تواصل بين يعني اللي موجودين بالمظاهرات ينقلون الأحداث الحقيقية. أيضا من صارت الانتخابات اللي صارت قبل كم شهر، اللي صار أنه أي شخص على الفيسبوك يحرض الشعب أنه بمقاطعة الانتخابات يلغون حسابه ويهددوه بالسجن. طيب في ظل هذا المناخ السياسي اللي نعيشه بالعراق، عندما أذهب الآن لأدرس التربية الرقمية للطلاب، كيف أدرس التربية الرقمية وفق هذا المناخ السياسي؟ أنت ربطتي حرية الإعلام بالتربية الرقمية، كيف أدرس التربية الرقمية مع هذا المناخ السياسي اللي نعيشه الآن بالعراق؟ بالذات العراق احنا الآن نمر بظروف جدا صعبة وفق، تعرفون يعني حكوماتنا يعني مستغل الشعب إلى أقصى درجة ومستغل البلد إلى أقصى درجة. شكرا.
So it's true that when you engage in free media, you can face consequences. I spoke about the number of journalists who die or are attacked worldwide. It's higher when it comes to free media than it is other kinds of broadcasting, for example. But we can learn from the diversity of tactics that free media activists have used worldwide throughout history. You know, you talked about Tor, Bob, and the use of that on the internet, but there's also the history of clandestine broadcasting, and that's what the FLN was when it was doing the Voice of Algiers radio broadcasting. They were broadcasting from remote areas into cities, and they were doing it anonymously. People weren't using their names on air. They were trying to protect themselves. There's ways in which people do try to work around the limitations of the law, work around the consequences, and find the wiggle rooms to find the spaces in which they're able to achieve their goals, say broadcasting. When Radio Balad first started broadcasting, they were initially a web radio. And they sent that radio signal into Palestine to broadcast on some of the unauthorized radio stations in the West Bank. And those signals went from Palestine into Amman. So the Jordanian government had no authority over unauthorized broadcasting in Palestine. So they were able to broadcast in the city of Amman before they had an FM license. And they didn't face repercussions from it because they weren't doing anything illegal under Jordanian law. But because they made this action and they achieved their goals, they were able to somehow perhaps nudge or force the Jordanian government to change the policy, change the law. Similarly, in Mexico, recently there was an effort to set up cell phone towers in remote regions. So big companies, big telecommunication companies are not necessarily interested in setting up telecommunication infrastructure in remote regions because there's not that many people to make money off of through cell phone subscriptions. So you have large areas of Mexico that have no cellular connectivity whatsoever, but people want access. And so communities realized that through open source technology and computer servers, they could set up their own cell phone towers. So they started doing it. They found a little piece of spectrum that no one was using, and they started connecting up to that spectrum and building local infrastructure for telecommunication. And then those activists went to the government and said, sorry, we're kind of doing something illegal, but you have the spectrum, you're not using it, maybe you can give it to us. And so the government did actually allow, as long as there's no telecommunication company locally in this rural region using this piece of spectrum, then it's allowed for this rural community to access that spectrum. But recently, in the last year, the government of Mexico has decided that those communities need to pay taxes. Not only do they need to pay taxes for use of that spectrum, that they need to pay back taxes. So there's currently a lawsuit between those local communities and the government worth tens of millions of dollars around this use of spectrum that previously the government wasn't even using. So yes, with regard to teaching about using free media and being within the education around media literacy, it is important to also talk about the ethics, to use different examples of safety that people have built in around their practices, to talk about the pros and cons of producing media anonymously, if that is needed in order for people to produce and share media content safely, but then what are the ethics of that, right? Because anonymity in media can be very dangerous because you don't know who to hold accountable. But then it can also be dangerous to be free and be speaking and then be held accountable by a government that might disagree with your opinion. So I think the best conclusion with regard to your question is to look at different experiences and the successes and the challenges of all of that, to be able to share with your students what the experiences have been globally in different regions with regard to the practice of free media. So there were some more comments here. We have a few more questions right here. 5 minutes left. Okay, so maybe we'll take a couple more points.
Yeah, so I still have a problem with the definition, because for me, if we say it's free media, it should be for everyone, then automatically extremist groups would be included. So how do we say that it's free media that is that's only conformed for values that have it's also like we get back to the situation where we say we don't want a hegemonic discourse, but on the other hand we want to create another one that has like positive values and ethics, so we automatically want to exclude other groups. So what do we do about that?
So this is a really interesting point that you brought up, and I'll share a story from when I was a kid in Louisiana. There was a community access channel. So you walk into this television station, you sign a piece of paper, and you can go on camera. So I grew up with watching people's home videos. They would go on vacation, and they would record their vacation time. They'd sign up at the community channel, and they'd actually play their videos on the television. But that kind of free access where anybody can sign up for a TV show also meant that the Ku Klux Klan had a television show. This is a white supremacist organization, and these Klan members would actually come hooded and dressed in their Klan outfits and do a show promoting hate and racism on air. And that's considered a free space, community access. So there's a lot of debates about the access of media and the ethics around that. Recently in Colombia, part of the peace plan in Colombia, so the war between the paramilitary, the military, and all the drug lords and everything, developed an agreement, a peace plan. And that peace plan included opening up community radio licensing for the paramilitary, because the military and the state have radio, well, the paramilitary forces wanted access to radio too. So what are the ethics of that? I think it comes back to not necessarily limiting who has access, because once you limit one, it's easy to limit another, but more focusing on media education, media literacy. People have to be literate about the kind of media they're tuning into. They have to recognize that when we tune into something like the TV station that I tuned in as a kid, why is the Klan on air? Well, anyone can sign up here, you know? At my community radio station, CKUT, we did have ethics in our approach to who we allowed on air. And sometimes establishing those ethics were very tearful conversations. Sometimes they were very threatening conversations too. So we had started a Palestinian community radio show, as I had mentioned, that had launched Radio Free Palestine, called Under the Olive Tree. And when we did that, we had Zionist student groups coming into the station wanting their airtime too. And we had to decide as a radio station, would we allow Zionists on air? And we fundamentally said no, we would not, because they promote racism, because they promote hate. And so, like the radio stations I talked about in Morocco, they have ethical guidelines that they have passed for their web radios, and they're against sectarianism, they're against hatred, they're against sexism. So determining what your ethics are is critical when you produce free media. Otherwise, you're gonna have the Ku Klux Klan on air. So thank you for your question. Let's come to the very patient man here. And it's gonna be finished. Okay. Can we just get his last comment?
Hello.
It's the last comment, I promise.
Well, I've been waiting for the last like 20 minutes, sorry. Well, free media is like to address public and gain publicity through like promotional efforts and like paid media, like through advertising. But I was wondering like to what extent or point free media is free, taking into consideration funding, and because you know like community radio stations, they need money. So the sponsor, I don't want to like have let's say in mind that they would like impose like policies or something like that. But to what like point free media is free? Because at the end of the day, they need the money.
So I had posed this question to Radio Balad because, as you saw in the political economic numbers in Jordan, is that they were concerned that they are getting money from USAID. So actually Radio Balad published a press release saying we do not take money from USAID. They also practice BDS, boycott, divestment, sanctions. So they published another press release saying we don't take any money from Israeli foundations either. So being very public about where your money comes from is critical, and also creating mechanisms by which your funding is separate from your editorial lines is a way to create and impose independence. So the dollars don't come in, the dollars that come in don't influence the content that gets on air. So there are, again, thank you to everyone who talked about ethics. It's extremely important to practice free media ethically, but it's even more important within media literacy to teach about the ethics of media when it comes to the influence of funding, when it comes to the practices of free media, the limitations and the dangers. So I hope all of you take this forward in your own media practices, but in your own teaching about media literacy, because unfortunately free media, media that's not controlled by states or corporations is often neglected when we teach journalism practices or when we teach media education. We forget to go to the source of where media education ultimately started, was with free media. So thank you for your time today. I really appreciate it.